Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for hosting this hearing. Thank you all for being here. You know, we heard earlier that Republican priorities are misguided. And that was a little shocking because I think our priorities are guided quite well and are very clear. And they're this: provide energy to the American people that fits three criteria: reliable, affordable, and clean. I don't think that's very controversial. Reliability is number one, of course. It has to be, because energy production is pointless if it isn't reliable. Society cannot function if it cannot keep the power on. Affordability is second. Americans need to be able to afford reliable energy without massive government subsidies so that they can drive to work, heat their homes, and benefit from a thriving economy. Third, Republicans want our energy to be clean. And yes, we can have energy that is reliable, affordable, and clean. It is possible. Also worth noting that America's natural gas revolution is the single largest factor in reducing America's carbon emissions. Switching from coal to gas accounted for 61% of emission reductions in the US since 2005. If we cared about global emission reduction, we might note that the US natural gas is 42% cleaner than Russian natural gas, which is why Republicans advocate for more natural gas exports to displace foreign coal, which, by the way, accounts for about 50% of total global power emissions. Seems that would be some pretty low-hanging fruit if carbon emissions was actually the goal. Also worth noting that Republicans are by far the strongest supporters of nuclear energy, which is both reliable and 100% clean. Maybe our colleagues would join us in fixing the outdated permitting process that makes a 4-year project last for 15 years. My Democrat colleagues, most of them just want to talk about wind and solar, which isn't reliable and only affordable if you subsidize it. They say we can just build a bunch of batteries to deal with the intermittency problem of renewables. They say we can clear hundreds of square miles of land for solar and wind farms and pay China to mine and process all of our critical minerals so that we can pretend that we aren't actually responsible for the environmental devastation of Chinese mining practices and the enormous amount of emissions that result from processing it all. So my question to my colleagues is simple. If the goal is actually reducing global emissions, then will you work with us to improve our absurd environmental permitting regulations that are choking off our ability to not only build pipelines, but also build the solar and wind farms and battery backup systems that you claim you care so much about? I know some of them are, because my friend Scott Peters was just talking about it. And surely my colleagues would find it troubling that something like the 10 West transmission line, whose groundbreaking ceremony was attended by Vice President Harris last year, won't actually be online until 2025. The planning actually started in 2016. Just for a simple 125-mile transmission line on public land. So that's nearly 10 years from start to finish, nearly 4 years of which was just to get the environmental impact statement approved. We put a man on the moon in less time than that. Does that seem like a healthy permitting and regulatory system to anyone? Surely not. It's not just transmission lines, it's critical minerals too. In Nevada, we couldn't build a lithium mine because of some useless plant called TM buckwheat. I'm not joking, you can look it up. In Oregon, we can't mine for lithium because of a sage grouse, which is basically just a fancy version of a chicken. In Minnesota, this administration halted the Twin Metals project over vague environmental concerns. Now, this mine would have produced taconite iron ore, copper, nickel, cobalt, all of which are needed for any renewable energy project. My point is this: the false narrative that we can transition smoothly to a wind and solar-only future is not based on anything that resembles reality. It's a fantasy. And it's a dangerous one that will quickly take us down the failed energy scenario that we now see in Europe. Wind and solar certainly have their place, but when energy demand will increase by 50% over the next 50 years, intermittent renewables will never, ever, ever be enough, and it's time to let that fantasy go. So am I promoting oil and gas? Yes, I am. In fact, the quickest way to reduce global emissions would be to ensure that our cleaner natural gas is displacing foreign coal-fired power plants. That single feat would have a larger impact on global emissions than any other solution offered. In fact, the industry thinks we could quadruple gas exports in the next 10 years, if we let them. If that gas displaced foreign coal, it would reduce emissions more than the combined impact of doubling our wind capacity, installing solar panels on every home, and electrifying every vehicle in the country. So you want solutions for reducing global emissions? Build pipelines, build export terminals, lease the land for drilling, and send some special trade reps to countries like India and Indonesia to make a deal. That's a realistic solution, and it's actually doable. Reality has to guide our solutions for the future. We cannot sacrifice energy reliability for radicalism. We must be rational environmentalists, not radical environmentalists. And we have to remember that the prosperity of the American people depends upon reliable and affordable energy. And I yield back.